3000 NFL mock draft.
3000 NFL mock draft.
With your friends Kenneth and Rob. Talking about the NFL draft of the Seahawks. 3000 NFL mock draft. 3000 NFL mock draft.
All right, as it said, this is 3000 NFL mock draft. I'm your friend Kenneth, and with me is your friend Rob. Rob coming from SeahawksDraftBlog.com. You may be listening to it over there. And if you're not, check out FieldGoals.com, which of course you've heard by now. And if you're listening to this to FieldGoals.com, where I come from, you'll want to check out SeahawksDraftBlog.com. I'm Kenneth Arthur. He's Rob Staten. This is March 15th, 2016. We are, about 6 or 7 weeks away from the NFL draft. Seahawks picking 26th overall. We usually talk about the Seahawks if you don't know that by now. And today we are going to talk about some of the Seahawks' potential trade or free agent targets, their moves, and focusing on that offensive line, both in the draft and in free agency, and maybe even in trade. The Seahawks, they've moved that first-round pick in some form or another in each of the last 4 drafts, beginning with 2012 when they traded down a few spots with the Eagles, who took Fletcher Cox while the Seahawks took Bruce Irvin. Fletcher Cox obviously turned out to be a better player so far than Bruce Irvin, but that 2012 class in general in the first round has mostly turned out to be one of the better first-round picks and draft classes of the 2000s. There have been some interesting ups and downs and some crazy twists and turns. I mean, who would have considered that here we are sitting in 2016 and Robert Griffin, his market isn't all that strong. He's still waiting for a team. Meanwhile, Mark Barron, gets a huge raise and a contract from his team, the Rams. And then, there's other guys that it goes up and down, Justin Blackmon, not in the league. And then there's some of the best players out there, notably guys like Chandler Jones, who went right there at 21st overall to the Patriots. You've got Harrison Smith, the second pick by the Vikings at 29th overall. Doug Martin, who signed a big contract at 31st overall. And, of course, the Seahawks let Bruce Irvin get away. But that 2012 class, and the reason that Chandler Jones was able to be dealt, it's that he's going into that fifth-year option. He wasn't given an extension by the Patriots. He hasn't been given one in this deal with the Cardinals that we know of yet. And there's other guys that have either been extended, who have signed free agent deals, or who are going into that fifth year. And it's that fifth-year deal where sometimes maybe teams would be interested in moving that money off of the books, and sort of also avoiding that huge contract extension that's going to be coming next year. And even though they would get a comp pick for like a guy like Chandler Jones, the Patriots get a second-round pick instead of a third-round comp, which probably would have been what they would get had they kept Chandler Jones and let him hit free agency next year. It's something that they're going to get earlier in advance. And whether or not the Seahawks will move that first-round pick, those other guys in the 2012 class who are going into those fifth-year deals may be of interest as well. The Seahawks could still very much be on the trade market looking for an offensive tackle or several other positions. Rob, as far as Chandler Jones go, he's coming into the NFC West, the biggest rivalry for the Seahawks right now being the Cardinals. They didn't have, their best sack guy last year was the 36-year-old Dwight Freeney, who is not coming back to Arizona. He had 8, Calais Campbell had 5.5. And nobody else had more than 5. So as far as Chandler Jones goes for the Cardinals in their matchups against the Seahawks, what are your thoughts on this deal? And what are your thoughts on them losing Jonathan Cooper and their second-round pick?
Well, first of all, they are in a position where if we think that the Seahawks are in a specific championship window, Arizona's is even shorter because they're relying on Carson Palmer, who is well into his 30s now. May not have too many years left. They're trying to win a championship while they can with him. So they feel that it's worth bringing Chandler Jones in and sort of giving them the kind of pass rusher that they've not had since Bruce Arians took over that team. He's incredibly athletic. I think he had something like 12.5 sacks last year, and he didn't play every game. He's ideal for them, and it's going to be a good pickup for them in terms of talent. The only issue is that why have New England been trying to trade him since the end of the season? He had a very serious issue at the end of the year, and that has raised some character flags. And I think that New England have been pretty smart looking at this, because they know that they are, if they want to re-sign Chandler Jones in the offseason, it is going to cost them a ridiculous amount of money, because they've just watched Olivier Vernon sign a deal which is worth an average of $17 million a year. And given that Chandler Jones is a character concern, they are not going to want to pay him that much. They've got a couple of other guys they want to play. The linebacker Collins and Hightower, the other linebacker that they'd rather pay on defense, and it's going to cost them less to keep those guys. So if Chandler Jones has another 12.5 sack season, they're not going to keep him. They're going to lose him. They're probably going to get a third-round compensatory pick for him. So all they've done is moved it on a year in advance. They trade him now and get a second-round pick instead of a third-round pick. And they get Jonathan Cooper, who has been a big disappointment in Arizona. But, that's kind of like a throwaway thing for them. They just use him. They can see if they can turn him into the guy that he was projected to be. So it's kind of a no-lose for New England. They felt like they were going to lose Jones anyway, so now they've just took what they can. I mean, the thing from Arizona is they may well get a really good boost in 2016 with Chandler Jones, but are they going to be able to keep him in a year's time? Because they don't have a masses of cap room. Are they going to want to spend what could be essentially an $18-19 million contract on him in a year's time? Is he going to stay out of the character issue situation? And how prepared are they to lose him in a year and just get a third-round compensatory pick and say, okay, we had him on a one-year rental and it cost us essentially a round in a draft. So it's an intriguing trade. I don't think there's necessarily a loser, but whether, that New England can probably feel like they can get an impact now with that second-round pick immediately. Arizona get immediate impact, but in a year's time, it's going to be very interesting to see who got the better of this particular trade.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, too, because Chandler Jones is probably going to get paid a lot in the next offseason with the deals that Malik Jackson and Olivier Vernon got this year. You would think that Chandler Jones may even be a better player than them on many nights, but it is kind of interesting that his tackles for a loss was not that impressive. It's something like 11 tackles for a loss. He just had the 12.5 sacks. His QB hurries, he actually had fewer QB hurries last year than Jabal Sheard, the guy from Cleveland that they signed last year and who they may really like. A guy that may have been, a Seahawks type guy, the under the radar, low key type of signing that the Patriots have gotten the most out of Sheard. And in this particular case, you really can say, I think that both teams win the deal. The Patriots didn't have a first round pick. Now they get an extra second round pick. They pick back to back 60th and 61st. And they've done really well with a lot of those types of picks. Meanwhile, the Cardinals losing out on a second round pick, it could be not detrimental, but it could be a negative if they only get Chandler Jones for 1 year, which seems very possible. And if he doesn't have this huge type of season, that one thing that they were not that great on defense was getting sacks, but was it because of the personnel, and how much of it was because of the personnel, and how much of it was because of, the scheme, and how many more elite years does Calais Campbell have out of him? And it's interesting, too, because now the Cardinals have a couple of those guys from the first round of the 2012 draft. Another guy being Michael Floyd, who's going into his fifth-year option. $7.3 million cap hit for Michael Floyd. He has not played that well overall, but we've also seen Marvin Jones get paid quite a bit. And is Michael Floyd as good as Marvin Jones? Is he better than Marvin Jones? How much is he going to get paid? And some of these other guys that I'm looking at as far as potential trade targets, we can get to Joe Thomas. I mean, Joe Thomas, certain, I think, concessions would be had to be made in order to acquire Joe Thomas or something like that. But if the Seahawks were working on a big trade, do you think that they would give up their first-round pick for a guy like Joe Thomas, pay him all that money? Could they afford him? And would the Browns accept a first-round pick? For Cleveland, they might feel weird sitting here this year without a late first-round pick that they can use on a quarterback that they will ultimately release in a couple of years. So do you think that Cleveland would accept that kind of a deal?
It's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to say on both accounts, because if Cleveland does end up taking a rookie with the number 2 overall pick, trading away arguably the best left tackle in the NFL would seem like a bit of a dumb move, especially since they've already lost Mitchell Schwartz. I mean, one of the big strengths of Cleveland has been the offensive line. They've lost Schwartz, they've lost Mack. If they lose Thomas as well, they'll be putting a rookie quarterback behind what you would suspect would be a pretty terrible offensive line. I mean, they've just signed Alvin Bailey. Is he going to start at left tackle? I mean, you're looking at turning a major strength into a major weakness. So I'm not sure whether Cleveland, even for a first-round pick, would be interested there. They'd probably want more. I mean, I think the deal with Denver was a first and a second-round pick, and maybe something else as well, a bit of change on top of that. So they would probably want more than just the number 26 overall pick. And from the Seahawks perspective, you've got to look at Joe Thomas and say, as good as he is, he's going to be 32 this year. And if you're going to give up more than a first-round pick for this guy, you're spending a lot of money on what would be an extreme short-term measure. I mean, you may get 2 or 3 years out of Joe Thomas for, a couple of picks that otherwise could be spent on a guy that you might have for a minimum of 5 years, or if you want to re-sign those guys, if they become core players, possibly 7, 8, 9, 10 years. So it'd be a real. I know that a lot of people would say, well, how can it possibly be a gamble trading for a guy as good as Joe Thomas? But it would be a pretty calculated gamble, because you're sort of banking on him staying at a certain level well into his 30s, which doesn't happen to many offensive tackles. And you've got to sort of counteract that with, at number 26, you're going to get an offensive tackle who is athletic, has got a high ceiling. They may not be immediately as good as Joe Thomas or as good as Joe Thomas, but you might have them during their peak years for longer, which is something that the Seahawks have to balance out. Plus, they've traded so many. I mean, they're 2 big trades so far for Percy Harvin and Jimmy Graham have not exactly been home runs. So doing it again would seem a little bit, to me, almost a little bit desperate to sort of win now, do it in this window. Eventually, the Seahawks are going to have to start hitting on some of these first-round picks. They're going to have to start using the draft to build and sustain. And I wouldn't rule anything out. I mean, there's still a chance that they will do some kind of a trade at some point, but I'm not sure whether I'm on board with, first and second round pick for Joe Thomas, or first round pick and a player and something else for Joe Thomas. That just seems like an awful lot to give up.
I mean, in the completely opposite spectrum of Joe Thomas, the Seahawks have signed Bradley Sowell and Jamarcus Webb. They gave Webb enough money to think that not only for sure will he be around this year, for at least the beginning of the year. We've even seen they're willing to move away from a guy like Kerry Williams, who they gave a 3-year deal to. They're willing to move away from him in the middle of his first season. So they gave Jamarcus Webb enough money to think that he's going to not only be around, but compete seriously for a starting job on the offensive line. Thoughts on those 2 players?
Well, I think that with Webb, I think it's an interesting one, because he's a guy who, I mean, he's a pretty out there character. He's quite interesting. I noticed on his Twitter account that he describes himself not as single, but as very single, whatever that means. And he seems to have this nickname of J Webb Nation, which just seems a little bit strange for a pretty average offensive lineman who's kind of moved around the league quite frequently. But the Seahawks seem to have seen something in him that they like, to give him a contract which pretty much guarantees that he's going to be on the roster at least this year. It won't cost them too much to move on after the 26th season if they want to, but he's going to be part of the team. He fits their size ideal at right tackle and at left guard. We talked a few weeks ago, Kenny, about the potential of Phil Loadholt coming in and being that kind of a guy who gives them just a bit of a hedge there, right tackle, left guard type of guy, and someone who could work within this system and has got the kind of skill set that they like. And I think that maybe Webb is their plan B, because the Minnesota Vikings didn't end up cutting Loadholt. They restructured his contract. He's going to stay in Minnesota on a pretty modest deal, and they brought in Webb instead. And I just think that that's the way that it's worked out there. They've got a bit of flexibility with him, and although I think he was graded quite poorly, he did start 16 games for the Raiders, and the Raiders had the number 4 ranked pass protecting offensive line last year, according to Football Outsiders. So as a line, they did something pretty well. Webb was part of that, and I can see him fitting in. And then they've got Sowell as well, who is just, for me, just going to be a camp body, somebody who's going to provide a bit of competition that they didn't have, who can maybe act as a swing tackle or guard. Just a bit of extra veteran competition. That is one of the big things they didn't have last year, was enough guys competing for positions in camp. They basically had to put Justin Britt at left guard, and he was unchallenged by Terry Poole, a rookie who didn't really have much of an impact. There was no real challenger to Gary Gilliam at right tackle when Britt moved across. They had to play the guys they had to play, essentially, and I think they want to avoid that this year. I think they want pretty much every position someone competing for a role, and I think they want people to win jobs this year, and that is why they're bringing in a lot of different guys. And they looked up to Ted Larson, they've looked at other offensive linemen who could come in and join this competition. I think that's the way they're going to go. I don't think we're going to see. Maybe Russell Okung will come back on a deal which is favourable to the team, but I don't think we're going to see that big name come in. I think they're just going to see a lot of competition, some rookies coming in as well, and then have a bit of a battle in camp.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like Russell Okung is getting the sort of news out there that he was hoping to get during his free agent tour. And, another thing about Jamarcus Webb, it's interesting because looking back at the offensive lines in 2010 to 2012, which I did for an article on Field Goals Today, it's just interesting like how big of a role Paul McQuiston really played on those teams in 2012 and 2013. I mean, he started 8 games at left tackle in 2013 when they won the Super Bowl. Paul McQuiston, I mean, he may not be great, he may not be good, but he was important, and there was the versatility. They don't really have a strong 6th offensive lineman, which is something that they were clearly missing last year while they were putting out some of those awful performances. And then I think you do feel an obligation to play a Justin Britt and a J.R. Sweezy and not really challenge those guys once you get started, even though I think in another world, maybe Mark Lewinsky does play better than J.R. Sweezy and gets an opportunity. I think that something that gets overlooked a lot in the NFL is when you're an offensive lineman and you're at the second string, I mean, the first string guys in practice get, say 20 reps. Then you come in and there isn't a lot of opportunity for the coaches or whatever to really see what you're doing, because you're getting half as many reps. And if you're third string, you get like 3 reps. So if you're third string, then you're not getting anything pretty much. They don't have a lot of opportunity to evaluate what you do. And secondly, they don't have any opportunity to see what you do with and against the first string guys. So you're not getting out there and they're not seeing that chemistry or that team between a Mark Lewinsky and a Gary Gilliam, which is, part of the reason I think that they were out there with Drew Nowak for so long. They're when they have so much competition and when they have so many guys in there, it gives them more of an opportunity to try different combinations. And at the same time, when Drew Nowak wins a camp battle or a preseason battle to be the starting center, then he's the guy getting all the reps. And that's why it takes 5 or 6 games before they're like, okay, do we really pull this guy who was better than Patrick Lewis, according to us, in the preseason? Do we now pull him and put the guy in that we thought worse than him? Because it's not just as simple as plugging and playing. You have to put that guy in practice. You have to see, and then sort of in another realm, you have to cross your fingers. And that's part of the reason that a lot of these times when a guy comes out of nowhere, seemingly, and comes in at the end of the season, in the final quarter of the season, or the second half of the season or whatever, and you're like, how is this guy not playing? How is this guy not starting? Because they weren't seeing him in practice. Because you need to get you only have so much time for practice, and you need to see and you need to get those reps in for the guys that are planning to start. You can't waste a bunch of reps on the guys that you're not planning to start, and you can't just start moving guys around. So when you've got a guy, you do want to have as many guys in there as possible. You want to find your best starting 5, and if you don't have enough of a competition, if you've just sort of said, well, we've got Justin Britt, he's going to be the left guard. If you don't have anyone else there to really say, well, maybe he won't be. If you have got a Jamarcus Webb in there who's got experience and now you're paying him, then you might be able to say, like, if you know who your left tackle, your right tackle, your right guard, and your center are or whatever, then you can say, okay, Jamarcus, we want you to go against Justin Britt for this position, and then you are getting enough of a chance to see those two guys go against one another. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think everything you say totally makes sense. And I think another thing to sort of add to that, Kenny, is that I think that offensive line has always been a kind of a fan's positions. So like fans have kind of brought up watching football saying that games are won in the trenches, and they feel that unless you have a fantastic offensive line, then you are going to struggle in the NFL. Now, there's only really one team that has got an offensive line where you could probably name 3 or 4 guys on that unit, and that is Dallas. Because that particular unit gets a lot of attention. But what people don't realize is that according to Football Outsiders, Dallas had actually the 19th best pass protection in 2015, which is, it's below the average mark. It's in sort of the bottom half of the league. And the teams who were at the top of the list for pass protection were teams like St. Louis. Now, could anybody out there, if you were to go to most Seahawks fans, could they tell you one member of the St. Louis, now Los Angeles offensive line? They probably couldn't. There were 2 rookies starting on that line, taken in round 2 in the middle rounds. They had an undrafted center. They had a former tackle playing guard, which is exactly how the Seahawks have been built. Baltimore were actually the number 2 ranked pass protection line in the league, and they threw away their left tackle, Eugene Monroe, midway through the year because he wasn't playing well enough, and then moved Kalichi Osamili out there. So, they had a lot of trouble up front, and yet they're ranked number 2. The Seahawks were actually in the top 5 for run blocking, which is exactly where they want to be. So, it's hot. There are no good offensive lines in the league. And what you have to do is you have to identify what type of team you want to be, and you have to get on with it. And while the first half of the year was bad last year, it was only as bad as the secondary was, with Cam Chancellor holding out, Kerry Williams struggling. It was only as bad as, Russell Wilson was hanging on to the ball too much, wasn't getting it out there, wasn't making the most of Jimmy Graham. Marshawn Lynch was clearly hurt and wasn't playing his best football. There were so many issues the Seahawks were facing. It was just sort of one aspect of it. And if people remember in 2013, as you rightly point out, Paul McQuiston and Michael Bowie were playing tackle for several weeks, and the Seahawks were horrendous. I mean, their game in St. Louis during the 2013 season, the line couldn't, me and you could have had a sack that night. So, people have to remember that this line has had some issues pretty much throughout the Pete Carroll era. And yet all they have to do is put a line on the field that will be in the top 5 in run blocking as it was last year. And it's probably just sort of 23rd for pass protection instead of 30th. And they will be just fine as long as they sort out the secondary as well. And the passing game in general, and that Russell Wilson gets the ball out as quickly as he was in the second half of the year. The offensive line should not trouble people as much as it does.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about a tale of 2 halves. I mean, everybody, we can't you can't just evaluate the whole season as one. Malik Jackson just got $90 million. Look at his pressures in the first half of the season compared to the second. He was below average in the first half and one of the best in the second half, and it was that second half surge that really got him paid. And if the Seahawks, they were the most horrendous blocking for pass protection in the first half of the season, pretty good in the second half, and so there is no continuity there with J.R. Sweezy leaving, Russell Okung probably possibly leaving, but if they like Patrick Lewis, who they're paying $1.7 million to or whatever, so he's entrenched as the lead for the starting center. They like Gary Gilliam, they like Mark Lewinsky, and Marcus Webb enough to challenge for that left guard spot or be a swing man, and then we'll see what happens with the left tackle spot. Speaking of which, I alluded to earlier, I want to go over these guys that are going into their 5th year, just like Chandler Jones is after he was dealt, and whether or not they would be potential trade targets, because it's not just for the Seahawks, but just in general, and I'm not saying that it's common or whatever to trade these guys, but it is interesting because teams may be in this mode now where if they're going to get a comp pick, maybe they can get a better one, or maybe they can get the same one a year earlier and save that money and put that cap to something else because they have different players that maybe have stepped up, because you gave out these contracts earlier, not knowing exactly how these guys would perform in 2015, and now they have to maybe make a decision. So, Rob, I'm going to reel off these names one at a time, and I just want you to tell me, have they lived up to the expectations that you personally had for them in 2012, and are they worth the amount of money that they're going to be paid? Are they, a waste of money or a bargain? Starting with Matt Khalil, $11 million this year.
Well, Matt Khalil has not lived up to expectation. Obviously, his brother Ryan has had a terrific career with Carolina, and he was supposed to be, a sure thing at left tackle. He was in danger of being cut. You know, a lot of people were speculating that he may get cut this off season actually. So he's a lucky guy. He's not lived up to expectation in the slightest. I just wonder when his contract runs out with Minnesota whether or not he's destined to move inside and maybe switch position because he's just been a pretty big disappointment for the Vikings overall.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting, similar to the move of Robert Gallery, former Seahawks left guard for one season. After 4 years at tackle, they moved him inside. The Raiders did. Stephon Gilmore, the Buffalo Bills, $11 million this year.
Yeah, I think that he's been as good as. I mean, he's not pushed himself to be one of the top quarterbacks in the league, but he's a steady player. You know what you're going to get from him. You know there is a dearth of great cornerbacks in the league, so he's a good, not great cornerback. And you know, when Janoris Jenkins is getting a huge contract with the New York Giants, I think that Buffalo can be fairly satisfied with what they've received from that first round pick.
Yeah, it's been a fairly shocking cornerback market with Janoris Jenkins and Trumaine Johnson. You know, it was somewhat unexpected, I think, for a lot of us to see those kinds of deals given out. But cornerbacks, as we've seen with Byron Maxwell, there's just so few of them that you can really feel like you can rely on. And then that can come and go in a year. Dontari Poe, $6.1 million.
It's not a great deal of money for Poe. I mean, that's, you know, I think you can kind of stomach that amount of money. Poe has had flashes where he's looked fantastic, and if you can remember what he was coming out of college at Memphis, his tape was pretty awful. He didn't do anything on tape. He was not an impact player in the slightest. But then he went to the combine and did his workouts and just looked incredible for a guy his size. You know, unnatural mobility and athleticism for a guy that big. Carried the weight really well. And in the NFL, he's made a lot more plays than he did in college. So I think that given the rare nature of players of his type, and given that Kansas City moved towards a 3-4 and needed that sort of figurehead, that nose tackle up front, I think you've got to say that it's a good deal for Kansas City.
We spoke about him earlier. Michael Floyd, $7.3 million.
Well, Michael Floyd's a pain in the arse because he only ever plays well against Seattle. You know, you could watch 10 Cardinals games and the guy won't do a thing. And then every time he plays the Seahawks, he seems to come up with a big touchdown or, you know, some 30, 40-yard downfield play. So I don't think that I was never a big fan of his. At Notre Dame, he kind of flattered to deceive. He was this big 5-star recruit, had all sorts of issues off the field. He then chose not to declare for the draft, went back to college, didn't do a great deal. And he's always been a guy who could be better than he is. Now, $7 million, did you say? It's not a, you know, again, when you look at the types of deal that's like Mohamed Sanu has just signed and Travis Benjamin, it's kind of in that ballpark. Arizona throws the ball a lot. So you can kind of stomach that kind of money. But when he gets to the open market, I cannot imagine that the Cardinals are going to be making a big push to keep him.
You may remember in 2012, that was the year with Robert Griffin, and that's when the Rams traded down, picked up a bunch of other picks, but they traded down from 1st to 8th or to 1st to 6th with the Redskins. And then, you know, most people don't remember they traded down again from 6th to 14th, picking up the Cowboys' 1st-round pick and their 2nd-round pick, which they again traded. Probably to their own detriment because the Bears used that pick on Alshon Jeffrey, but they used the next pick and the 14th overall pick on Michael Brockers, who seems to be getting a little bit better every single year, though that does line up with their addition of Aaron Donald, the best defensive tackle in the game. So how much do you like Michael Brockers away from Aaron Donald and his $6.1 million price tag?
Yeah, I think that you kind of hit it there with the fact that he gets to play next to Aaron Donald. Now at LSU, he looked like he could be a 3 technique at the next level, but there wasn't any real pass rush production, you know, on tape. You didn't see him living in the backfield. He's pretty much what he is, which is, you know, a guy who absorbs blocks and makes life a little bit easier for Aaron Donald. There was some talk at one point, I think it was pretty much about a year ago, that they were willing to move on from Brockers, that maybe they were willing to trade him, or that he could be on the chopping block there to leave. He's not quite lived up to maybe the expectations of St. Louis. And that, when you look back at that draft, it does sort of make you wonder. They traded down twice, they accumulated loads and loads of picks, and in the process, missed out on an opportunity to draft someone like Luke Kuechly. And in a draft when it was strange, because it always looked like a draft that in the top sort of 10 picks you would get some decent value there. But then once you left the top 10, it became much of a muchness. And like, you look at the guys who went between 12, where Fletcher Cox went to Philadelphia. So that after that, you've got Floyd Brockers, Bruce Irvin, who was in Seattle, Quinton Coples, who was a bust, Drake Kirkpatrick, who was a bust, Melvin Ingram, who's not been great, Shane McClellan, who's been meeting the Seahawks today, has not worked out in Chicago, and Kendall Wright, who's been hit and miss. So there you picks up to number 20. It's curious that the Rams moved out of that top 10 where there was a fair amount of value. And really, in hindsight, they must be kicking themselves a little bit that they didn't seriously consider Luke Kuechly with that number 6 pick that they got.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a few players that were next up. Drake Kirkpatrick, as you said, a bust. He made 3 starts in 2000, so he didn't play that much at all in 2012, the first year. 2013, he made 3 starts, had 3 interceptions. The next year, he made 2 starts, had 3 interceptions. This year, he made 15 starts and had 0 interceptions. So he gets more playing time. He had 16 passes defensed. Stats are what they are, but like you also, as we have said, the cornerback market, it's tough to find anybody that can fit back there. Drake Kirkpatrick, $7.5 million, with the Bengals, in the position they're in with Leon Hall and Adam Jones and everything like that. The $7.5 million to get 1 year out of Drake Kirkpatrick out of Alabama, is that a horrible deal for them? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I never liked Drake Kirkpatrick as a player. For me, he was a beneficiary of the sudden emergence of Richard Sherman in 2011, and sort of the move that was just starting to develop for sort of tall, athletic cornerbacks. But when you watched him play for Alabama, he just didn't look comfortable. He was beaten. He didn't have the sort of the deep speed and the range and the fluidity. He just looked like a tall, stiff cornerback who was being slightly overrated because he was playing for what was a fantastic Alabama team at the time. And I think I'm right in saying that the Bengals have spent at least 1, maybe 2 first-round picks on cornerbacks since they drafted him. So that would suggest, although they do like to take cornerbacks early, that would suggest that they're not satisfied with him. He's never lived up to the potential, and sort of following Cincinnati's progress over the last sort of couple of years, because they've been one of the more interesting teams in the league. There's a real frustration with him that he's not worked out. So they're going to have him for a little bit, just maybe as a depth pick. Maybe he'll have a chance to prove himself this year in a contract year. But no real great player of any note there, and someone who I don't think when he hits the open market next year is going to have done anything to improve his stock and cash in a way that Janoris Jenkins did.
You mentioned Melvin Ingram, the San Diego Chargers linebacker, pass rusher. What I remember from him in that draft year was tiny arms and T-Rex sort of tiny arms. You could ask Donald Trump what he thinks about tiny arms and what that says about a person. But for Melvin Ingram, the first 3 years, 6 sacks. He had missed about 19 games. But then this last year, full-time starter, he's got 10.5 sacks, 52 tackles, 3 forced fumbles, and 6 passes defensed. We've seen with guys like Malik Jackson and Olivier Vernon, you don't need consistent production. You don't need to have a great season every year. You can have one good year. Melvin Ingram goes into this year with a chance to put together back-to-back good years, and if he does that, if he gets another 10-sack season, could get paid $90 million next year. Don't be fooled. It could happen, but he's $7.7 million this year. Seems like a bargain for the San Diego Chargers. But do you think that last year's 10.5 sacks and all that kind of stuff was just a fluke, or do you think that if he stays healthy, he is a good player?
Well, he's always been a player that has kind of promised much and hasn't necessarily delivered. In the draft, there was a lot of talk on the blog in 2012 about this guy because he was being rated quite highly in that range. Very active guy, reasonably athletic, as you mentioned, the arms there. not long. Whether or not he would outstretch his arms like Donald Trump did and say, "Look, there's nothing short about these," and then make reference to his penis, is another matter. But I do think that he struggles because of that lack of length. I don't think the Seahawks would have been particularly interested in him because of that. He's a little cannonball of a player, but he's always, what is it really is his best role, because with the lack of length and the size, there's a 4-3 end, not particularly great. I don't think he's ideally suited to play, outside linebacker, which is where San Diego has him playing. So he was always kind of like that. Guys, how do you get the best out of him? Now, 10.5 sacks last year. If he can do that again this year, then he has an opportunity to get paid, because defensive linemen who get sacks are getting paid right now. But there's just something about San Diego's defense across the board. It's full of guys like Melvin Ingram. Manti Te'o's on the line, linebacker rather, and their cornerbacks are, their names, but then the guys that haven't quite delivered. They kind of remind me a little bit, Kenny, of the Seahawks defense when Patrick Kearney was there, and people like that, Marcus Trufant and Dion Grant. It was a bunch of guys, Julian Peterson. It was a bunch of guys whose names you knew, but as a cumulative group, they weren't very good. And that's kind of how what I would say about San Diego. Somebody's got to have the production. And for me, it just happened to be Melvin Ingram that last year, and it's not that he's a particularly great player.
Kendall Wright, you also mentioned him, and I was very vocal 2012, 2013, very vocal in saying that Kendall Wright was not a good player. He's a fine, okay player. Relative to a bunch of players, he's good, but his 94 catch, 1,079 yard season in 2013 as a 24-year-old did nothing to move the needle on me whatsoever about whether or not he was going to be a great receiver. That's not good numbers as far as I'm concerned. You get 94 catches and you only turn it into 1,079 yards, 11.5 yards per catch. He had 139 targets, so it's more like 7.5 yards per target. Just 2 touchdowns produced out of all of those catches. The next year, what did he do? 57 catches for 715 yards. Last year, 36 catches for 408 yards. When they gave him that 5th year, they were expecting, I think, a lot more. Obviously, the Titans in position right now, they need they need receivers, and they pick up Rashard Matthews. They need someone to be Marcus Mariota's number 1 dude. Kendall Wright, $7.3 million, same as Michael Floyd. Maybe he is more of a reliable inside the box type of receiver that a team would prefer over Michael Floyd. But between Floyd and Wright, which guy are you taking?
I think that Wright had been dealt a bit of a bad deal there. He's a pretty weird guy, though. He was there was something about him not wanting. I think wasn't his reaction of one of disappointment when they drafted Marcus Mariota or something, because he was quite close to Zach Mettenberger, who was the quarterback the year before.
Right.
And he is a talented player. He looked good for Baylor. He's athletic, he gets open. He can be a great slot guy who can work outside as well. And I think one of the issues he's had is that he's never played in a good offense. If you put Kendall Wright on the Patriots offense, or on the Cardinals or the Steelers or something like that, he probably does pretty well. I think he's probably looking forward to leaving the Titans and actually playing on an offense that is good with a quarterback. He's the kind of guy that maybe in a year's time the Seahawks could have a look at if the price was right. So I don't think he's a bad player. I just think it's a bad situation.
When I took the time, when I looked at it a couple years ago, and I don't know why I cared so much, but when you plug in the numbers for that kind of a range of yards per catch and yards per target, and then that many targets, and you look at the history of the NFL, nobody really stands out. So if Kendall Wright does go to somewhere else and does produce at a higher level, he will be the first. And so that's kind of why I think of him as a guy that sort of cherry-picked a lot of catches as the only option in what I would agree is a very bad offense without any good quarterbacks, and was the most reliable option for them at that time. But at $7 million, he really has to perform this year, and he really has to be, more than just a safety net for Marcus Mariota, because if you're picking up 7 yards or 9 yards on 3rd and 12, you might as well do nothing at all, because it's not producing anything. You need to pick up those first downs. You need to be a valuable number 1 receiver. On the Seahawks offense, is he a better player than Jermaine Kearse? I would say, yeah, he probably is. But from the standpoint, it is interesting to think of, where Kendall Wright could fit in a year or two, and whether or not he would be a trade target right now. What would you trade for Kendall Wright draft pick wise, knowing that he's going to cost something?
Oh, I wouldn't trade much at all because from a Seahawks perspective, I think that they're pretty. They've got the receivers now who they had when Russell Wilson broke franchise records last year. I don't think there's a great need to go out and sign, trade for a guy like that. And I think that the one thing they perhaps lack that they would like to have is a big target. They've been looking for that guy. I mean, they have been looking for a bigger athletic target for a while now, and they still don't have it. So I think if they can get that guy, possibly in the mid to late rounds in this draft, then I think they will do it. Or maybe it's
what if like a Cleveland though? Do you think Cleveland and Kendall Wright makes sense?
Yeah, that makes an incredible deal of sense. If I was the Browns and I wanted to put some weapons on the field to help a quarterback, that's exactly the type of call I would make. And I think a 3rd or 4th round pick would be a decent gamble.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Cleveland isn't doing anything really, much of anything at all. It really seems like they are deconstructing even further, which, once again goes to the Joe Thomas point. Do they want to continue to deconstruct, or do they want to have some form of stability at the one position that sort of serves as the safety barrier that holds everything else up and keeps it from, because you don't want to just completely deconstruct and have such a bad season that, the franchise quarterback gets hurt and all this kind of stuff. There's got to be some sort of stability. But yeah, the Browns have money to spend. They're not spending it because they can't attract anyone. But if they could trade for a guy like a Kendall Wright, it doesn't matter if they pay him $7 or $8 or $10 million because they have money that they need to spend. And they don't have a whole lot of receivers. They lost Travis Benjamin. So it does make a lot of sense. Travis Benjamin and Kendall Wright, probably about the same amount of value for me personally. A guy that I think the Seahawks would much rather target than obviously like a Matt Khalil. For them and, for their offensive line, this is a guy that only cost $8 million. Thoughts on Riley Reiff?
He's been pretty okay.
Mm-hmm.
If I could put it that way, because the Lions are then one of their top needs is a left tackle, and he's been playing left tackle. So that suggests that he hasn't been a roaring success. I don't think it's so much that he's the issue. I think he's just better suited working inside or as a right tackle. I mean, when he was coming into the league, he was, a pure right tackle. I think he may be better at guard. The Lions have spoken to Okung, and if they don't bring in a veteran offensive lineman, then there's every chance they're going to take one in the first round of the draft. So I just think that he's been okay-ish. Not a bad play. Typical kind of Iowa offensive lineman. They always kind of look great, but then they come into the pros and then they're never quite as good as you'd hope. So they're going to try and replace him at left tackle. He's probably going to get moved around. And it could easily be Okung that replaces him there.
Right after that, David DeCastro, the guard, born in Bellevue, Washington, my hometown, went to Bellevue High School, fuck the Wolverines, goes to Stanford. A lot of people wondering whether, they were projecting maybe the Seahawks are targeting David DeCastro in the first round in 2012, though they were probably picking too high to take a David DeCastro. Even if they traded down, in retrospect, would it have been that bad of a move to take a David DeCastro? There was injuries involved. He only played 4 games his first year. He moves up, playing regularly for the Steelers, and last year is an all-pro. He is, going into his age 26 season, and he costs $8 million. Thoughts on David DeCastro and whether or not the Seahawks, we've talked a lot about how the Seahawks do not make splashy moves in free agency, hitting free agency a year from now. Is that someone that you look at?
David, I wasn't a big fan of David DeCastro going into the draft. I mean, he was being touted as like this top 15 pick and, one of the best picks in the draft. And, he ended up dropping to 24. He's been okay. And then last year had a decent year, but I was never overly impressed with him. And in Seattle's system, he's very much a right guard. And they've managed to plug guys into that spot, and looks like Glowinski's going to get a chance to do that. So from a Seahawks perspective, not really, but from a Pittsburgh point of view, they've had a decent pickup there. I know that the Seahawks in 2012 were very keen to increase their speed in the front seven. They had Leroy Hill and I think David Hawthorne as linebackers, and did not have any pure speed up front either. And that is why Bobby Wagner and Bruce Irvin ultimately came in. And that was a priority for them to address, though, that need to get some speed up front. So David DeCastro was never a likely option. I mean, in hindsight, he's a solid guy. The Steelers may well re-sign him on a longer deal, but he also seems to me like the kind of guy that could easily hit the market, make $8-9 million a year, and just go and play somewhere else, and the Steelers just carry on. And he's just a guard, and he's not a quarterback, so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these guys, offensive linemen, especially interior offensive linemen, it seems like teams love to have them when they have them. But when it comes to hitting free agency, they would just as soon let one of these teams that has $50 million in cap room way overpay for them and let that happen over there, and just realize that that's part of the game now, that teams have to spend a lot of money. And if they're going to spend a lot of money, it might as well be for an elite guard rather than spending a lot of money on, say, a good wide receiver, knowing that they can also get a good wide receiver in the draft, just like a team that doesn't have a lot of money can get a good guard in the draft, especially if you're picking anywhere in the first round. Tackle, as we see with the Seahawks, it's not as easy to replace. If Russell Okung, signs somewhere else, then that's something that's going to be difficult for them. Then we can talk about, there was a fake trade announced on Twitter as we recorded this, a fake Mike Garofalo account that announced, that the Seahawks have traded Cliff Averill for Luke Jokel of the Jaguars. Skipping ahead a little bit here, Luke Jokel and Eric Fisher both going into their fourth and final years of their rookie deals, about $7 million each. They both also have the options for 2017, which in line with Matt Khalil's deal would put them at, probably $11 or $12 million the next year. Even though Eric Fisher and Luke Jokel have not been really pleasant, I haven't really lived up to the expectations of being top, 2 picks. Nobody really would in that draft because it was just a bad draft. That being said, the Eagles paid Lane Johnson, the 4th overall pick, a lot of money. They gave him the extension. Eric Fisher and Luke Jokel, is there a guy out of those two that you would prefer? And would you just like to stay away from them both?
Yeah, I'd want to stay away from them both. I mean, Luke Jokel this is the thing, I've had some guys on the blog this week even saying, why do the Seahawks go for athletic upside on the offensive line? Why don't they just take some guys who can block well? And Luke Jokel is kind of the poster child for why that doesn't necessarily work at the next level. Because here's the thing, and Pete Carroll, just to give you a quick story, that people may well have heard this before, but Pete Carroll, when he came into the Seahawks, was asked, how do you think that USC would do against a pro team? And he basically said that the cornerbacks and the wide receivers could hang, they could perform, the linebackers could do okay. But the one area that would be, a complete massacre would be in the trenches. So that if the college defensive linemen would get abused, the college offensive linemen would struggle massively. And, looking at the reason why that is that you've got to be not just sort of incredibly strong and athletic to sort of deal with the grown men that you're facing in the NFL, the 300-pound guys who were always the most athletic guys in college. You've got 5 of them in front of you now, or 4 on the defensive line. You have to be physically brilliant to cope with that kind of that toughness and that skill that you need up front. You've got to be one of them as well. And Luke Jokel is not that. I mean, Luke Jokel was a technically gifted blocker, but then he goes to the next level and he's coming up against a guy that just bullies him, and he hasn't got the physicality to counter that. The technique that he had in college is no good to him anymore because the technique is totally different in the pro level, and he gets found out and he struggles. And his future is probably going to be moving inside to guard because he to me does not look like a capable blindside blocker. They've signed Kelvin Beachum today, and they may well give him an opportunity to start at left tackle, and they may move Jokel from the blind side. Mm-hmm. Eric Fisher was much more physically adept, but this is a guy, let's not forget, that was at Central Michigan who basically went from being a 20th overall pick to the top overall pick because of a Senior Bowl. And when you're sort of letting one event like that totally dictate your opinion, and you're saying, hey, this guy's athletic, this guy's tall, this guy seems saying all the right things. Let's take him with the first overall pick because there's nobody else there that kind of warrants it. I mean, it's Kansas City's bad luck that they had the first overall pick on what was a ranked bad year for players like that. But their decision making with just taking Fisher, it was a sound kind of thought process. Take a guy who might be able to do all these things, but he was never really. If you watched him, he never really looked like a number one overall pick. So I wouldn't want to go. I would much rather have one of the tackles in this class, one of the ones who falls to 26, and just take him in the first round, than make a trade or a deal for either of these guys.
There are just a couple other guys that went in that 2012 draft. Might as well just finish it. I'm a completist. Dante Hightower. We talked about the Patriots trading away Chandler Jones. They're one of their 2012 first round picks. The other being Hightower. $7.7 million that they'll have to pay Hightower. I don't hear his name called a whole lot, but you don't really hear a lot of the guys on the Patriots' names called a lot. Usually they're talking about Tom Brady and sometimes Julian Edelman. What are your thoughts there?
I just think he's a beast. He's the type of guy that is incredibly reliable. You know what you're going to get from him. He sets the tone on the defense. He's a typical Patriots linebacker. Wasn't a stunning athlete going into the draft, which is why he lasted until number 25 overall. But he's just a really solid player, and that is, the Patriots are going to end up paying that guy. With Chandler Jones having moved on now, that they're going to pay Dante Hightower, and they're going to have him for a few more years. Yeah, just a typical Bill Belichick style defensive player, and one of the key components of that Patriots team.
And finally, the last one here going into his fifth year, Harrison Smith, the safety out of Notre Dame, went to the Vikings 29th overall, another team that had two guys that they took in that first round. Free safety, was a Pro Bowler this past year. A lot of people thought he was the best defensive rookie in 2012, at least out of that first round. And, he overcame an injury in 2013, had 5 interceptions in 2014. Harrison Smith, is he on that path to being one of the great all-time safeties, or is he just a very good safety? $5.2 million.
I think he's just a very good safety. He gets banged up a little bit, but he's a good guy, good character guy, fairly rangy. When the Vikings don't have him, you notice. And they really need to put someone next to him who is capable of complementing what his skill set is, and that is something I believe that the Vikings are going to try and do. But he's a really good player. He's the type of guy you can rely on, but he's certainly not Earl Thomas, that's for sure.
And let's talk. Might as well get one more out here. 41st overall. He didn't go in the first round, and he was drafted out of Georgia, I believe. Playing guard. Immediately moved to left tackle for the Buffalo Bills. Cordy Glenn is 26 right now, 6'5", 345 pounds. Was given the franchise tag, $11 million. How much of that franchise tag is the Bills sort of being in their position of not wanting to have to replace the left tackle just like the Seahawks are? And how much of it is Cordy Glenn is actually an elite left tackle, because this was a Bills team that had Jason Peters, one of the best tackles of all time, had to let him go at a certain point, goes to the Eagles. They find another gem here, it seems, with Cordy Glenn. But is he an elite left tackle? Is he someone that is worth $11 million? And if the Seahawks were to acquire him, would he be worth, a first round pick and then another high draft pick? What are your thoughts on Glenn?
I wouldn't want to sort of make that kind of a deal for him. I mean, what he is a pretty serviceable left tackle, and the Bills did the right thing franchising him, and we can see that now because look at the big name left tackles that were in free agency. Russell Okung has still not got a team. Donald Penn has still not got a team. Kelvin Beachum is coming off the ACL, has just signed a deal, might end up at guard for all we know. There wasn't a great left tackle on the market, and if Cody Glenn had got into that sort of market, he would have been paid a ridiculous amount of money, and someone would have started him at guard or at left tackle for sure. So the Bills, all they've done is ensure that they keep him for at least another year. They can then, they've got a bit of cap mayhem going on in Buffalo, which is typical of a Rex Ryan team, by the way. So they may struggle to keep him beyond this year, but they've kept him for at least another year. They had to do that. The franchise tag is probably less than he would have got on the open market. So it was a wise decision by Buffalo because, what else were they going to do? I mean, there's the clear that Russell Okung is whatever he was expecting to get on the open market, he's not getting. And it's the same for Donald Penn. So I think that teams are willing to wait out for the draft now, and they understand that there's 5 or 6, maybe 7 or 8 guys in this draft that can start at left tackle or right tackle pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, and good transition. I mean, we're just going to, quickly hit on it again in this draft podcast. But, it's interesting talking about Cordy Glenn and talking about Jason Peters and, talking about some of the other very good to great left tackles and tackles in the NFL and players overall. But, the Seahawks don't need an elite left tackle. They need a decent one. They need one that can do the job. They need one that's not a detriment to the team. There's interesting, sort of philosophy that people seem to be adopting, that you need elite players at every position. And maybe it's because Seahawks fans have become selfish from the fact that they do have, for regularly over the last 4 seasons, 4 or 5 or 7 elite players. And they expect that left tackle position. They know how important it is. And if you have a great one, you'll do that much better. And the idea of having one that's merely good is terrifying, I think, to a lot of people. But that is sort of the reality of the league. And as we've talked about, finding great offensive linemen right now is probably the hardest thing to do in the NFL because of all the positions. The one that seems to be losing the most talent to the other side is offensive line. If you're going to be in the trenches, if you're a guy like, thinking about what you're going to become and you're, 6'6", 320 pounds or you're getting into that range, who are the highest paid players in the league over the last 5 or 6 years? Is it Damakung Suh? Is it Albert Hainsworth? Is it Malik Jackson, Olivier Vernon, J.J. Watt? I mean, these are the guys cracking $90 and $100 million. And Russell Okung can't find a job. I mean, he can find a job, but he's waiting. And the best tackles out there, you might get franchised and you might get $11 million. You might pick up that 5th-year option and get $11 million. You might get out there and get a nice deal. You might even sign for, $60 million like Kelechi Osemele or, something like $50 million like Brandon Albert, but they're not cracking those $90 and $100 million marks. And if I'm a young high school 18-year-old being recruited by, Alabama and Florida, and, they're asking me what side of the ball do I want to play on, and I'm getting my choice to set my path and my future. I'm maybe even if I have to go to a lesser school to stay on the defensive side of the ball, I do that. Now you've got, a very talented player, which I am, going to the other side of the ball, and that's only going to continue to trend that way as you get through college, and that's what we're seeing now. And these guys are just, destroying, lesser tackles, breaking, these sack records as we sort of have more and more, passes, but it's also, that you can on both the left side and the right side because they're getting outmatched so frequently. And it always comes down to money. And if you can't really deny that money is going far more to the defensive side of the ball than it is to offensive side of the ball. But when you get a great one, if you can get that, just in the same way that the Seahawks got Russell Wilson, the amount of money they saved on having a franchise quarterback for those 4 years on his rookie deal, what it did for them as a franchise in order to spend elsewhere was huge. They had, a great quarterback that I think has become an elite quarterback. And if you can find one of those guys in the draft at left tackle, it's going to do a lot for you. They didn't even have that luxury with Russell Okung, who they've really only given 2 big offensive line contracts out in the Pete Carroll era, which is Okung, the first pick that they had to sign to a big deal before the CBA, and giving an extension to Max Unger. Other than that, they really don't do that on the offensive line. So they especially want to find someone that can play that left tackle position that is on a rookie deal. So, there are guys that do come through and play well, quite well, and are not top 10 picks at left tackle and of course at guard and right tackle. So as we get closer to the draft now, Rob, who are the guys that you might be identifying in the 1st and 2nd round that can come in and, play adequately, because they've not had as much success with James Carpenter and John Moffitt when it comes to those 1st and 2nd round picks at the position. Carpenter obviously played right tackle very briefly before, they found out that he could only play guard. Justin Britt, another second-round pick that they quickly, just were like, he is not a good right tackle. We got to move him to guard. And then John Moffitt, who was just not a good player overall.
Well, I'm glad you asked because it's probably my favorite topic at the moment. And we talk about it a lot on the blog. And, I do think that this is a good offensive line class. Now, a lot of people have focused on the defensive lineman, Kenny, and there is a lot of depth there. But if you actually look at, who are the really high upside, freaky athletes in this class, and it's not the defensive lineman, it is the offensive lineman. So who's going to be off the board that they're not going to be able to take? Laramie Tunsil, Ronnie Stanley, Jack Conklin are not going to be there. But if they want to tackle in the first round, Taylor Decker, is more than capable of playing tackle or guard. Might be a bit too tall for the Seahawks. He's 6'8", but very solid, athletic player. Jermaine Ifedi, who might be the favorite to be the Seahawks pick, is an absolute monster. He looks like the Hulk. He's got a fantastic base and balance to his play. He's incredibly long. He's explosive. The great thing about someone like Jermaine Ifedi is that he could come in and he could be an exceptional guard. The best comparison for him physically, if you go on Mock Draftable's website, the player that they compare him to most physically is Osemele, who has just gone to Oakland. And there's this great little tool, which is a Seahawks fan has actually come up with, and it's called SLA. That's SLA, if you want to dig it out. And a Seahawks fan called Evan has put this together. And SLA stands for size, length, and athleticism. And Jermaine Ifedi is actually in the 98th percentile for NFL offensive linemen. He's an absolute freak. So he ticks that box. The Seahawks love upside. At the very least, he's going to be an assembly-style guard. He could play tackle. For me, he's probably the favorite to be the Seahawks pick if he's available at 26. But then there's other options as well. There's Jason Spriggs from Indiana, can play guard or tackle. Sean Coleman, who we've talked about a lot, it looks as if he is going to be around into that late first-round range, is a guy who could easily play guard or tackle. And then LaRaven Clark, who's incredible upside again, is technically as deficient as any offensive lineman you will ever see in college football. But, if he's starting from scratch and the coaching technique, that he could be an option. And then if you want to look for the interior, so you take the tackle stroke guard in the first round. If you wanted to come back and take another offensive lineman in rounds 2, 3, or 4, you've got terrific options there as well. I mean, we've talked about Nick Martin. Looks as if he's going to be more of a top 50 guy than a top 25. Cody Whitehair from Kansas State can play guard or center. Christian Westerman from Arizona State could play guard or center. Connor McGovern, who looks like he was made to play in College Navy. I mean, he again, another terrific athlete, comes from Missouri. We know the Seahawks love that. They love tackle experience in their interior lineman. For me, Connor McGovern looks like a Seahawk in the making. You've got Graham Glasgow from Michigan, who can play guard or center. You've got Garnett from Stanford, who we've talked about a bit. Joe Dahl, who is at Washington State. There's countless options there. This is a really good draft to fit in 2 potential starters into your lineup for the next 4 years and possibly beyond. So there are so many options there for the Seahawks. It just makes a great deal of sense to me to invest 2 of your first 4 to 5 picks in the line and just feel pretty good about it.
I think that's a good point, and lots of things that I think you can look forward to is seeing the Seahawks use some of those picks on offensive linemen and really sort of building up that competition and getting as many good bodies in camp as you can find. Hopefully one day in the draft, someone will name their son like Camp Goodbody, and that would be a good name for a football player. Just like this would be a good time to wrap this episode of 3000 NFL Mock Draft up. For more on Rob's thoughts there on Seattle's offensive line, go to SeahawksDraftBlog.com for his latest piece that has gone up today about there's no need to panic about Seattle's offensive line, more in depth about what you were just saying, Rob. Follow on Twitter at Rob Staten. Follow on Twitter at Kenneth Arthur S. Go to the sites, Field Goals and Seahawks Draft Blog. Subscribe on iTunes to 3000 NFL Mock Draft, where we kind of come at you sometime every Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. You can never know unless you subscribe, and then you'll be the first to get it. And yeah, I think we have some really good guests coming up in the coming weeks. and the draft is quickly approaching when we're just going to be, it's going to be a bonanza here on the show. So Rob, any parting words?
Well, hopefully next week we're going to have, there is a chance, working on this right now, that we'll have Rob Rang from CBS and NFL Draft Scout with us next week, which would be a really nice thing. You know, obviously very connected with the Seahawks as well. And yeah, we may even maybe have some interesting Seahawks news in the next few days. It feels like they're gonna start making some moves now. You know, they've signed a few guys, so maybe some other free agents are going to be coming in. We know that Shea McClellan is visiting them today, so there'll be a few things we can talk about that might influence the draft over the next few weeks as well.
Yeah, I think the something is about to break. I feel like with the Seahawks, they've been keeping up the streak of exciting news every offseason, like really exciting news, not like boring exciting news, but like really exciting news. And it seems like maybe they're just waiting to break another one here soon. We'll see. But that's it for us. 3000 NFL Mock Draft. Come back next week. This has been this edition, but catch us next time on the next draft.